Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen, wa salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Second part of Imam Abu Hanifa is his works. We talked a little bit about his life, and now to get into the main part, which is his fiqh. Just to, make a few clarifications here. People would generally think that Imam Abu Hanifa invented or came out with his own conclusions through the study that he did or the rules that he has inside of his fiqh and his understanding of the Quran and the Sunnah. Just like any one of us, you have to remember, a lot of his rules that he, recorded inside of his fiqh, he grew up seeing these and he followed those. What do I mean by that? Hammad ibn Sulaiman, right? Heard from Ibrahim al-Nakha'i. And I'm going to keep repeating these so we know the chain of narration. Ibrahim al-Nakha'i heard from Alqamah, and Alqamah heard from Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. So if somebody is living at the time of the Tabi'een, the generation after the Sahaba, he really needs not to ask too much for why he's doing something, right? So a lot of the things, the skeleton of his fiqh, had to do with what he did or what people were doing in Kufa. And he built upon that. He didn't have to start completely from scratch. What he did with those things that he grew up with, how some of us, we just grow up in a family that happens to be Hanafi. We happen to grow up in a family that happens to be Shafi'i. We happen to grow up in a family that happens to be Maliki. We happen to grow up in a family that happens to be Hanbali, right? The same thing with him. But he happened to grow up at a time where you really didn't need a specific madhab to understand the Quran and the Sunnah. You really didn't need that vehicle. Why? Because if somebody asked him, why don't you do this, to Imam Abu Hanifa, he would say, I don't do this because I heard from Hammad. Hammad heard from Ibrahim al-Nakha'i. Ibrahim al-Nakha'i heard from Alqamah. Alqamah heard from Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, and Abdullah ibn Mas'ud said, Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, this. And again, these are multiple names, but they're all from the same generation. They're not 50 or 60 years apart. So he heard from that one generation, from the generation of the Sahaba to Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Okay, so he didn't invent anything. He already had an outline of what fiqh was and how the Ahl Kufa that took from Abdullah ibn Mas'ud how to conduct their daily affairs as far as the Quran and Sunnah, which is the fiqh, extracted from it, how they had to conduct themselves. Okay, so he didn't invent anything. And the things that were already there, he would look at them very critically, as a jurist does, and debate with those, or the people that held those, or if he had a problem with those. He would go and debate those with the specialists, one of them being Hammad. Do you think his teacher, Hammad, that he studied with 18 years old, do you think he just took all the information and said, yes? One thing is you learning from somebody, but one thing if somebody is a jurist, how does a jurist's mind work? Especially when it comes to Quran and Sunnah. He hears something, which is what you call a faqih, which is synonymous with the jurist. He hears something and right away his brain starts working. How is this possible? That's how he thinks. Is this fard? Is this sunnah? Is this? He works everything that he has, all the tools that he has. And then he can make sense of it. Okay, I can understand why this person said something, even though he didn't give any textual evidence, because Allah says this in the Quran. That's how his mind works. He doesn't just say, okay, yes, you're right, yes, and he finishes right there. I learned from Hammad 18 years, and he concluded. No. There was lots of arguments that happened. And actually at that generation, since that was a generation of fiqh, it was considered high adab, as long as you kept your adab, to argue with your teacher. That's how Imam Abu Hanifa picked those 40 students. What was his criteria for picking those 40 students, those elites? As to who presented the best arguments to me, who gave me a challenge, who was competent enough and brave enough to come up to me and say, I have an issue with that because of this and this and this is the reason. So that was the culture of that time. Unfortunately, the culture that we have nowadays, if you question the teacher, he thinks you're questioning his credibility, which is not the ruh and the understanding of Islam. Because the Sahaba, even if Muhammad ﷺ did something, they would say, Ya Rasulullah, is this from the words of Allah or is this from yourself? And he would say, this is from Allah. Even the Sahaba had this adab. Did they love Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Did they love Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Of course they did. They loved him more than they loved his kids. They loved him sallallahu alaihi wasallam more than they loved their own families. But if they even had some suspicion, and Allah allowed them to have that suspicion because they're human beings, that Ya Allah, Ya Rasulullah, is this from the Quran? Is this from the words of Allah? And if he would say yes, or if he would say no. If he said no, they said we may have an idea that may be more beneficial. In Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says in the hadith, "Antum a'lamu bidunyakum." You guys are more aware of your dunya. So the things that had to do with this dunya, which he somewhat didn't have, because his specialty was in the words of Allah, right? So if there was something that happened to be with the affairs specifically for the dunya with no strings attached, he would say, you guys, you Sahaba of mine, you're more aware of your dunya than I am. Okay, so that was the culture that they would debate with their teachers, and that was considered an elite student who would present good arguments and challenge his teacher's mind. So, from the fiqh of Imam Abu Hanifa, he had a method, and he stated this method. And it sounds, on the apparent, it sounds like it's the obvious thing to say, but again, there's strings attached with a positive connotation. Now, with a negative connotation, he said that my usul, my way how I extract rules for the sake of Allah is, number one, through the Quran. And if I don't find it in the Quran, I go to the saying of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. If I don't find it in the saying of sallallahu alaihi wasallam, I choose from amongst the Sahaba whom I think is best befitting for this. What does that mean? Did he do something blasphemous by saying, I feel that the Sahaba are more befitted for a certain thing, or no? Do you guys think that's blasphemy? No. Because Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that there's a few Sahaba that are elite in some things. One of them being, excuse me, Mu'adh bin Jabal. He said, أَعْلَمُ بِالْحَلَالِ وَالْحَرَامِ Mu'adh bin Jabal. The one who knows most about halal and haram is the Sahabi known as Mu'adh bin Jabal. And the Sahaba that were known for fiqh was Abdullah ibn Umar, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, Abdullah ibn Abbas. So when it had to do with fiqh matters, what did he do? He'd go to those elites that were elite in fiqh, that were known for fiqh. So if it had to do with fiqh, he'd go with the sayings or understandings of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud first and foremost, because he came to Kufa. Or the saying of Abdullah ibn Abbas, the other jurist from amongst the Sahaba that Muhammad said is a jurist. And Abdullah ibn Umar, who was the son of Umar radiallahu anh, who was in charge of Mecca. So he said, that is my way, and that is how I extract. And obviously, if the Sahaba agree upon something, there's no disagreement in that. Because ijma' of the Sahaba, consensus of the Sahaba is considered Sharia. Okay? And then it comes more with the tools that he uses through ijtihad. Ijtihad means what? Ijtihad basically means that if he didn't find it in the Quran, if he didn't find it in the Sunnah, if he didn't find it in the lives of the Sahaba, he would utilize all of these in the Quran, Sunnah, and the lives of the Sahaba, and he would come out with the conclusion using the spirit of all three of those, meaning using the essence of all three of those. Where does he get this from? Again, that story of Mu'adh bin Jabal, when Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam sent Mu'adh bin Jabal to Yemen, and he said, Ya Mu'adh, O Mu'adh, what are you going to rule by with the people? He said, by the book of Allah, bi kitabillah. He said, and if you don't find it, he said, bi sunnati nabiyhi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, with the sunnah of Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And if you don't find it there, what are you going to do? He said, then I'm going to do ijtihad to the best of my ability. Ijtihad meaning working very hard to come out with a conclusion based on the Quran and the Sunnah. So ijtihad is not something that's just based on somebody, oh, I feel this way today, so I'm just going to pass this ruling. That's not how it works. And it's not one thing where you just say it and you pass it. It goes through a whole process where people argue with you, your students argue with you, other madhahib argue with you. What was going on in that room when Imam Malik, when he said that I loved Imam Abu Hanifa, but when I went in the room with him and we argued about fiqh rulings, it was the first time I had to wipe the sweat off my forehead. What was happening in there? Were they agreeing on everything? No, they were disagreeing on everything, or a lot of things. Disagreeing for many reasons, though. There's hikmah inside of that. One being the environment that you live in, which is incumbent or is expected for somebody who lives in a tent in a desert is not expected for somebody who lives in a hotel in the Sears Tower. It can't be done. And Islam caters for this. It's not something that the jurists came out by themselves. They rule according to the area that they're in. So Mu'adh ibn Jabal being in Yemen, when Muhammad ﷺ sent there, his rules were different in some ways based on the environment from the Sahaba that were in Mecca and the Sahaba that were in Medina. Okay? So the Mujtahid has to do the same thing. The first thing is being qiyas from ijtihad. Qiyas means analogy. So after the Quran, after the Sunnah, after the consensus of the Sahaba, is something called qiyas. Qiyas means linguistically analogy. Like what? In a very simple way, when Allah talks about the ayah of alcohol, right? And its hurma, meaning the reason why it's haram, right? Not only is it haram because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said so, is because the second reason is it alters the mind. Right? So what does that mean? That means anything that Allah is giving a message here. He's not saying that heroin is okay, cocaine's okay, marijuana is okay, it's just alcohol is not okay. He's saying anything like this is the head of all the evil, but anything that does something similar to that is also going to be in the same boundaries. The punishment may be slightly less or different, but it's the same exact thing. That's how qiyas works, in a nutshell. Okay? The other thing is istihsan, that Imam Abu Hanifa, and all of these things are, you can see, even though it's something that is considered man-made, it's still bound by the Sharia. That has to be understood. Do you guys understand how that's being done? It's still bound by the Sharia. He's not making up something else by himself, by doing qiyas, by making an analogy. He's using the reality that's present in the Quran and what? Implementing it onto something else, because it falls in the same category. Okay? The other thing being istihsan. Istihsan linguistically means making something okay, making something hasan. But it's almost the opposite of qiyas. Why? Example of istihsan. Okay? According to majority of the fiqhs or all the fiqhs, anything that you don't eat the meat of, meaning a dog, meaning a lion, meaning a tiger, and all these other things, of its remains of what it ate or bit into becomes haram. Okay? Understood? Anything that's haram to eat, especially that predator, if it bit into something else, it's haram to eat that animal. Okay? But the same thing goes for eagles and crows and all those other things. But what does istihsan do? Through ijtihad. Through ijtihad and through this ruling out legally, what it does is, it requires ijtihad. Why? Why is an eagle, why is a hawk, why is a falcon, even though eating its meat is haram, but if it eats from something else, that thing is not haram. Why? Can anybody guess? I'm sorry? Yes, very good. Awesome. The predator, when it eats its saliva itself, is najis and it mixes inside of the meat, right? But the bird, it's a beak, and the beak is dry. There's no saliva there. Do birds have saliva? Birds don't have saliva. Which makes that thing not haram, even though on the obvious it looks like it's haram. With true qiyas, it would be something haram, but that small thing that pushes it out of haram is that beak is made up of something like a bone, and that bone has no liquid or saliva in it, hence it's not haram. That's istihsan. And Imam Abu Hanifa utilizes it in ijtihad. And there's one thing we have to look at, is that the Hanafis were known for people who were the hunters of illah. Hunters, meaning they used to go after the illah. What is the illah? The illah is basically, in legal terms, in contemporary legal terms, is called the common legal cause. Which means what? The same thing we did with the alcohol and the marijuana, for instance, or the heroin. Is that the thing that intoxicates you, because Alcohol is haram because it intoxicates. So what is the illah? What's the common legal cause that makes this thing haram? It messes with your mind and your brain, and it makes you forget what you're doing and all that other things. It alters your brain basically. This is something that's called the illah. So if you find something that's haram, you say, what is the illah? What is the whole common legal cause and the reason for this being haram? Okay? So the Hanafis were known, they didn't just take something by the face value, they were completely opposite from what you call zahiri. Zahiri means that people, they take something only from the straight face value and they rule just on that. The Hanafis, what they did was, they were hunters of the illah. They used to say, yes, this is haram, but what is that thing that made it haram so we could base rulings on other things? Do you understand that? Am I going too much? Am I going into too much detail? Is good? Okay. So they were the hunters of illah. Remember that word illah, okay? And the last thing, which is very undermined at our time, is something called urf. And this has to be the number one reason for one of the biggest confusions in fiqh in our contemporary times. Urf, linguistically, means traditions and customs. Okay? Excuse me for 1 second. Urf means tradition or customs. Now, this is a big topic, and I'm going to try to summarize it as precisely and as in a short length as possible, because we have 15 minutes till Isha, to the adhan of Isha. By the way, we can conclude after Isha. We can have question and answers if you guys like, so I will be here after Isha, inshallah. Urf basically means customs and traditions in the people. Just like in Urdu, we say adat. That comes from the Arabic word, which is ada, which means what the people got accustomed to. Now, the understanding and the axiom of Sharia, in Sharia, is al-aslu fil adat. The original understanding in adat, al-ibaha. That it's halal. Ma lam yanzil alayhi al-hurma. As long as there's nothing specifically talking about that custom being haram. The original understanding of the Sharia is that if you happen, for instance, to go to a country that you've never been to, and you see the people doing something in a certain way, okay? And you see them doing that in a certain way, and now a Muslim, a mu'min, he thinks, okay, is this halal or haram? That's the first thing we always think about. Alhamdulillah, for the ni'mah of Islam, for the blessing of Islam. And that's how we should be thinking. Now, if it has to do with customs and traditions, and there's no religiousness attached to it, it's completely halal, there's nothing wrong with it. Again, if there happens to be something that has to do with customs, and Imam Abu Hanifa was known for this. I wish that, and I myself are from the Indian subcontinent, I wish the people that were from the subcontinent who claim to be Hanafis and are very proud of Hanafis would understand this portion of Imam Abu Hanifa's fiqh. I'm not saying anything bad about them, I just wish they elaborated on this part more. That means that if somebody is doing something and it happens to be from the customs of that country, from the traditions of that country, from the ada, nature of that country, and the origins of that thing is not a religious origin, it's completely halal, and at times it can come in ibadah. How can that become an ibadah? It can become an ibadah because you may be put in a situation where that one custom can be a vehicle to spread Islam. Right? And I'm going to give you an example of that. For instance, there's a hadith of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. He says, "Man tashabbaha biqawmin fahuwa minhum." A very misconstrued hadith of our time. Whoever resembles a qawm, man tashabbaha biqawmin, whoever resembles a qawm, a people, a nation, a land, a community, a village, fahuwa minhum, for he's amongst them. Now, if you look at this from the apparent, and you see people conducting themselves in a certain way. Oh, this guy, he's wearing jeans and he's wearing a t-shirt. He's resembling the kuffar. Haram to wear jeans and t-shirt. Is this what the Sharia asks us to do? Very valid question. Does the Sharia ask us to say as haram? Now we have to utilize this fiqh. This jeans and this t-shirt that people wear, okay? Does it have a religious origin or significance? No. It was actually made in Italy, or it was made in Italy where farmers used to use it because it was rough cloth, and it actually came in the form of overalls for farmers to wear because it's rough cloth. It was actually called denim. We call it jeans now, but it's originally called denim. They called it denim before. We just now call it jeans. But that was something that farmers used to use because it was rough cloth. Again, customs of a people to take care of their vital needs, which was farming. You guys are all dressed like farmers right now, okay? So, you guys can laugh, it's okay. But, so, it has no religious origins, right? So if now contemporarily what people do is, they take that hadith from the face value, and they say, look, Muhammad ﷺ said, he said, whoever resembles a qawm, he's from amongst them. But what's the illah? What's the common legal cause over here? What's causing you to pass that judgment right away? Okay? One example. The other thing being the bow tie or the tie. People claim that the origins of this is that it resembles a cross, which isn't. This was just something the British used to use because when they used to wear a jacket and a shirt, there was nothing there. It looked too plain, so they wanted to put something there. So first it started off as those frilly looking things, and then it went to a bow tie, and then it went to a long tie. There's no religious significance involved. If you don't believe me, look it up historically and see where the tie came from. It has no religious significance. So if you go to a land, or if you are in a land, and you see a custom happening, and it doesn't have to do with Islam or any other religion, there's nothing Islamically wrong with that. And the older generation, may Allah reward you guys. I'm not knocking the generation at all. You guys are the ones that brought Islam to this land. So hats off to you. We can't complain of anything about you. It's the very reason that generation before us came, I'm talking to my generation, that bought Allah's deen and put that stamp of Islam inside of that land, and they were indebted to them for that. But there's certain things that we may see in the older generation that now you can use, and you can take this fiqh home and understand and make that differentiation where things are cultural or if it's a misconstrued understanding. For instance, I met an uncle who said to me, he works at an Islamic school, and he says that I saw something so wrong, and I see it wrong all the time. I said, what is it? He said, I see people, they come to school every day with coffee in their hand, Starbucks coffee in their hand, or any type of coffee thing. They act just like the Americans, astaghfirullah. Can't you pass something and tell these people to change this? I said, whoa, let's take one thing at a time. This is where we have to utilize fiqh. This is because you have to understand a faqih, a person who's a faqih, he is a doctor for the ummah. He has to find a way for the ummah to conduct themselves in a healthy manner without compromising the deen. I'm not telling everybody to go and compromise your deen. I'm talking about Imam Abu Hanifa's fiqh and the application of the fiqh and how we use it today. And urf happens to be one of the main things that he was known for, but the people who claim to be Hanafi follow this least, unfortunately. So he says that they're just like Americans, and they come in with coffee mugs and coffee things in their hands. I said, number one, they're born and raised in America, so they're Americans. Okay, that's one thing. Can't really say too much about that. They're born on the soil. Whether you're happy with that or not, that's a whole different thing. But they're born and their papers all say that they're American. Number two, are they doing something un-Islamic with bringing coffee mugs, acting like Americans? Let's say they are acting like Americans. Are they doing anything un-Islamic if they're saying, we want to act like Americans? Let's say they're very explicit in their wording. It's a very brave statement I'm making, and anybody who has a problem with this, we can talk about it in a very other manner. If he says, I want to be like Americans and bring coffee to work every morning or school, and I want to have that coffee mug in my hand, is he doing something haram or no?
No.
Why not?
Nothing wrong.
Why is there nothing wrong with it? I'm not saying you're wrong. Why is there nothing wrong with it?
He's not drinking it. Coffee is not haram.
Number one, coffee actually invented by Muslims, first of all. in Andalus. So that, yeah, but yeah. The reason is that is a culture and custom thing that has nothing to do with religion. If somebody said, it's not, it may not be always the wisest thing to say, I want to be like an American it's not a very cultured person that would say this. Not a very well-read person that says this. Let's say he's a little kid and he doesn't know any better. You may want to correct him if you feel so, but he's breaking any rules of Islam? No, he's not. Because he thinks that this thing that's glamorized, let's say it's glamorized in American culture, is cool, right? But he's not breaking any rules with bringing coffee to work. There's nothing wrong with that. You could give him nasiha and say, you know what, you should try to be everything you can like Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Just say that I want to take coffee to work every day. Don't say I want to be like the American way. You guys understand what I'm trying to say. Number one thing is he's not breaking Islamic rules. So another way you can work with fiqh at your home and understand when you address people older than you, that fiqh understanding now can be working with you. And it can be something that is hands-on for you now because you have a certain, small summarized understanding of how that works. It doesn't mean that you go and make everything halal. No, you use Islam as a criteria. If there are strings attached from another religion, that's what becomes haram. So the hadith of Muhammad ﷺ saying, "Man tashabbaha biqawmin fahuwa minhum," which means what? Whoever resembles a qawm, so he's amongst them. What does that mean? That means if he has some type of religious symbol on him, if you're talking about clothing. Let's say I can be wearing a jubba, which people attribute this to an Islamic clothing. Let's say that is the case, even though that's not. But if I'm wearing a jubba and I'm wearing a turban and I have a cross on my shirt, that's what it's talking about. Why? It's because that cross resembles some type of religiousness of another religion that is other than Islam. Clear on that? That's what urf is. Traditions and customs, and that's how Islam sees urf and traditions. Everything as far as customs and traditions and mannerisms of people are halal as long as they don't break Islam or directly Islam negates that. Cool? The next part of his fiqh, which makes him different from everybody else, and we're going to conclude with this inshallah. We have about 5 minutes left, and I think the other portion may have to be done after the prayer, but we'll try to finish as much as we can. According to rest of the Imams, the three, Imam Malik, Imam Shafi'i, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, they classified everything as what? Fard, Sunnah, Mustahab or Mubah, Makruh, and Haram. 5, right? What Imam Abu Hanifa did is he made or added 2 more to these. Now people have a understanding where they think, just because it's wajib, it's like a sunnah, so I don't have to do it. That's not the case. What Imam Hanifa did was, he said, in my usul, the way I conduct myself and extrapolate rules and regulations, there's something called fard, and then wajib, and then sunnah, and then what? Mustahab, and then makruh tahrimi, and then haram. So he added on 2. What did he add on? He added on wajib, and he added on makruh tahrimi instead of makruh. Why? What's the reason for this? Imam Abu Hanifa, in his usul, in his understanding of Islamic jurisprudence, or extrapolating rules from the deen, he had this step after fard called wajib, which means what? First we have to identify what a fard is. To him, a fard was something that was established through a dalil, which means an evidence from the Quran or the Sunnah, which is known as qat'i. Qat'i literally means to cut, which means there's no difference in opinion in it. So the Quran contains ayat. The hadith has certain content which is qat'i, which means there's no difference of opinion allowed in that. Okay? So if something is said, when Allah says, وَأَقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةِ, establish prayer, right? Is there any difference of opinion establishing prayer? So he made that fard. Establishing prayer is fard. Now the how-tos inside of the prayer comes in what? Inside of the sunnah. Right? And some of those things are open to debate or what we call difference of opinion, which is called dalil al-dhanni. The first one we said what? Is dalil al-qat'i. Right? Dalil al-qat'i means that there's no difference of opinion allowed in it. Dalil al-dhanni means it's open to ta'wil, it's open to interpretation. One of the things are open to interpretation, but he concluded that those things that were open to interpretation, which means there's difference of opinion allowed in there, but he concluded that it's wajib, it's a fard to do it, he called it wajib. Okay? So the things that there's no difference of opinion allowed, he called that fard. And the other thing he called wajib, which means if you don't do it, you're still doing haram, and it can be a grave haram. It's just the way it came down to us and the evidence, the level of the evidence. So just because you skip out on something that's wajib according to Imam Abu Hanifa, it's still a fard. What I like to call it, what I heard from somebody else, is something really nice. Some people call it forest, and others like to call it trees. It's the same thing. Some people like to call it forest, or some people like to call it trees. That's how minute the difference is. Which means that he made this differentiation to let you know where it came from. The other one is why he differentiated between fard and wajib, is there's something called hadith mutawatir. Hadith mutawatir means that there is a hadith that came down to us from a humongous group to a humongous group with the tabi'een and a humongous group. Which means that, for instance, you see a car accident happen. You're one person, right? Now, if 10 people from 10 different buildings see in downtown Chicago one building happens, that's what? That's 10 people seeing one narration, right? Those 10 people go and tell another 10 people until it goes down. But these weren't your average people that saw something from Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There were certain, there's a whole science which I can't get involved in right now, which is called usul hadith, and how they make something at this level. So when something was established as mutawatir, and the Quran came to us as mutawatir, which means thousands of Sahaba read this to thousands of Sahaba, which makes it impossible for it to be any doubt. And there's certain hadith that are that way, which means this hadith was heard from this many Sahaba to a humongous amount of Sahaba to even a bigger group, which makes it impossible for it to be a lie or any type of mistake. When a ruling came down in that manner as mutawatir, Imam Abu Hanifa called it fard. And when a ruling, even though it becomes incumbent upon a Muslim, fard upon a Muslim, but it comes to the pathway of khabar ahad, which means that there's a Sahabi, basically 3 or 2 or 1, heard from 3 or 2 or 1, heard from 3 or 2 or 1, but they're all dependent people, and it's fard, it's binding. But he called it wajib because it came down to us in that manner. Not from a humongous group, it either came from 1, 2, or 3. Something other than mutawatir, he called that wajib. That's why, as Hanafis, that differentiation is made. Do you understand why the differentiation? It's still fard. But it's called that because of the way it came down. Another thing which would be considered khabar ahad, for instance, Mu'adh ibn Jabal. Like we said, he went to Yemen. Mu'adh ibn Jabal taught Ahl Yemen Islam and Iman, and he was one person. Right? From one person, the whole entire Yemeni community understood the Sharia. That's one person. So, as far as fiqh is concerned, according to Imam Hanifa, he made this differentiation for the pathway, if you want to call it, how it came down to us. Okay? And then after that, we have sunnah, and that's a whole, just like everybody else, anything that Muhammad did in a certain way. And the same thing goes now when we go down, is why there's something called makruh at-tahrimi and haram. It's the same as to fard and wajib, and why he said makruh at-tahrimi and haram. So he said there's something called makruh, which everyone agrees with. Makruh at-tahrimi, which is farther down the chain, and then you have haram. Makruh at-tahrimi is the same exact thing for and haram, as fard and wajib are. If it was something that Allah was preventing, for instance, he said la. When something la in the Quran comes and don't do it, it's something that usually becomes haram. And something that Allah orders you to do in the Quran usually is something that's fard. So when this thing which was makruh at-tahrimi, and Allah made something haram, or Muhammad ﷺ, I should say, made something haram, and it came to us from the khabar ahad, meaning relied to us through one sahabi, 2 or 3, on to 2 and 3 in the next generation of tabi'een, it was called makruh at-tahrimi, which is still actually haram. But it's just called something different for the pathway that it comes down to us. And haram is obviously something that came to us through mutawatir, meaning a group of Sahaba agreed with a group of tabi'een to a group, which means that it's impossible to be any doubt, and for that reason, he made it haram. Or the other thing is what we said, what? If something in the Quran or the Sunnah is something qat'i, where it's impossible or is not allowed to have a difference of opinion in fiqh, then that was something which was called what? Fard or haram. And if there was something that was open to interpretation, and he came to a conclusion that Muslims are questionable for this Yawm al-Qiyamah, he called it wajib. And if it's something that is disliked and hated like a haram, he called it makruh tahrim. Why did Imam Abu Hanifa come to this conclusion of doing ijtihad in khabar ahad, which means that if something came to him on a chain of narration with a khabar ahad, meaning what? Either 3, 2, or 1 Sahaba to 3, 2, or 1 Tabi'een, he would do his ijtihad in it. The main reason is, and we don't have too much time to get into it because of time, is that the time and place he was living in Baghdad and in Kufa, in that area, that was the most rampant place for people to fabricate hadith. So when people fabricated hadith, he was so strict, and people think he was easy on hadith. He was so strict on hadith, he said, for that reason, I'm not going to take khabar ahad directly, and I'm going to do ijtihad through some other ways, or extract from something from the Quran to supplement this, because I'm in fear of accepting this because of the small amount of chain of narrations. So that is, in a nutshell, his usul. After Isha, inshallah, I think adhan is now, right? Adhan is now, inshallah. I'm sorry to go past 7:45. I was supposed to stop at 7:45. I apologize. After Isha, we're going to open the floor for question and answer.
محمد مولي محمد